Welcome, friends. It is I, Empyrean Serpent, and on this fine day I bring with me a review of the newest album from the progressive power metal band Mortanius. Mortanius are an American band from Pennsylvania, though considering their sound I would be more inclined to believe they're a lot closer to Transylvania than anything. The band consists of Lucas Flacco as the vocalist and songwriter, as well as Jesse Shaw on bass, though for this album they bring in AJ Larson and Ollie Bernstein to perform the guitars, the latter of which being from the power metal band Osiodes and Illusion Force, and the album also features a pair of great guest vocalists, Leo Figaro from Ministrelix, Dragon Guardian, and Marching Station, as well as Jonas Heidgert from Dragonland, and hopefully I did not misenunciate any of those previous names, but I probably did, so oh well. Mortanius have been around since about 2013, I believe, and have released 3 fairly lengthy EPs up until this point, though today we will be covering their recent debut album, Till Death Do Us Part. I have heard the prior works from this band, and while all 3 EPs are fairly solid releases with a good sound, the songwriting more or less failed to captivate my attention too much. They definitely did have some catchier moments, but considering their newest release here, their previous work is overshadowed a decent bit, I would say. Till Death Do Us Part clocks in at roughly under 50 minutes, and at that only consists of 5 tracks, distributed amongst the 5-minute opener, the 2 subsequent songs, which are 10 and 9 minutes respectively, and the title track, which is a lengthy total of 18 minutes, and is essentially the closer on this thing. It is, however, followed by a cover of Wham's Last Christmas, though we'll get around to that later. Overall, there are some massive tracks on this thing, and for their length, they definitely do not disappoint by any means, as this is truly some top-tier progressive power metal, and certainly amongst the best of what the genre has to offer. So, from a thematic standpoint, most of the album is tinged quite heavily in feelings of sorrow, with some nice spooky touches here and there. It has a really nice overarching atmosphere, which emulates both some semblance of sadness and something that you would likely find in an older horror film soundtrack, which is quite a cool aesthetic to blend, and on top of that is reasonably unique. It definitely invokes some pretty creepy feels at times, though more often than not the album tends to make me a sad boy. That being said, the atmosphere and emotions on this thing also come across quite beautifully at times, especially concerning the title track in my opinion. In terms of lyricism on here, it's quite top-notch as well, and definitely contributes a ton to the themes and feels of the album. Most of the lines on here are quite well crafted, and read off very poetically and dramatic a lot of the time, and they integrate very well into the music. As far as the lyrical content, most of it is based around personal experience with life and personal outlook on life, with most of it, as you can tell, being on the more negative side of things. At that, it's quite broadly appealing, as a lot of the topics and lyrics can be quite relatable in that regard. At least that's the case with the first 3 tracks on here, because the final original track actually has much more story-based lyrics. On top of being an 18-minute epic, the story that the song follows is quite a well-put-together one. It's more of a ghost love story type deal, and starts off with a boy whose lover has died, leaving him alone in the world, thus causing him to sink into depression and eventually alcoholism, until one night, while drunk, he believes to see his lover's ghost beckoning to him. The protagonist here decides to follow her, and is eventually led to her grave, wherein he digs up her coffin and opens it, only to find her decaying corpse. Realizing what he's done, and realizing that he'll never really be able to see her again so long as he lives, the man commits suicide, lays down beside his dead wife, and the implication at the end is that the two are reunited in the afterlife. Of course, the whole story is told in much less plain terms than that on the actual song. As mentioned earlier, the lyricism is quite poetic, so yeah, look forward to that. Musically, the album holds up just as well, if not better, in my opinion. As far as the individual parts on this album, everything comes together very nicely. The vocals are of particular note on here, as Lucas Flacco's vocal tone is quite unique, and he's quite a talented vocalist at that. He has a fairly high vocal register and can hit some pretty impressively lofty notes. The sound is fairly floaty and of a bit of a higher pitch, and works very well with the music here while being quite interesting on its own. I could make comparisons to other vocalists and such, but really I would just recommend hearing them for yourself. Furthermore, the amount of vocal harmonies on this album is pretty wild. There's a big use of layering and backing vocals here, which is very well integrated. The guitars on this thing are quite impressive as well, with some fairly intricate progressive riffs and leads here and there, some quality shredding throughout, as well as some spicy solos thrown on top. Furthermore, the bass gets a ton of fairly unique and interesting parts on here, many of which are equally impressive, so that's always quite a good time. The lead, rhythm, and bass guitar are all performed quite excellently on here as well, so yeah. The percussion on this album is actually done via a drum machine, which is surprising considering how good it sounds. I can't exactly compliment it for technical prowess, obviously, but it blends quite well with the sound and manages not to sound artificial at all, which is a big upside. Furthermore, the keyboards on this boy are pretty lit as well, contributing heavily to the album's atmosphere as well as occasionally popping up with some great melodic sections. They add a ton of medieval flavor to the album actually as well, in the form of organs, piano, and other such less standard instrumental inclusions, you know? Overall, the vocals and instrumental sections on this album are all not only quite impressive, but very fun. And of course, the talent on display here supports the fantastic songwriting extremely well. Speaking of fantastic songwriting, the music on here, whilst being distinct in its power metal aspects, does tend to lean more towards the progressive side of things, everything considered. The sheer length of the songs on here alone indicates that quite well, with again over half of the tracks on this album being around 10 minutes or more. Naturally, with such long songs of such high quality, there is a pretty big amount of variety within each of them, and the progressive tendencies are quite notable through not only the song structures, but a decent bit of the riffing, the sound, and the use of instrumental variety as well. Once again, looking more at the keyboards on that one. There's a lot of fairly distinct atmosphere in that regard, and all of the songs are very well constructed, with many different intricate sections, and despite that, they're all extremely coherent. On the more power metal side of things is where we get a lot of the core appeal, though, particularly in the melodic aspects of this album. There's a big focus here on strong, catchy melody lines, and it shows through really well, as whether it be on the vocals, the guitars, or the keyboards, melodies here are all very catchy and very distinct, each lending themselves beautifully to the mood of the song as well. Furthermore, the choruses on this album are certainly some of the highlights, being the melodic highs of the album and always being both very memorable and generally quite emotional, which ensures each has a great impact on the listener. Despite the progressive tendencies the songwriting definitely takes to, the choruses essentially always stand out, easily getting stuck in your head, even after only one listen. As mentioned prior, riffing on here is pretty catchy and impressive, going from intricate passages to more melodic ones to heavier sections when needed, having some nice variety and being really well written overall. I'd also like to again point out the use of more medieval instruments on here, which ties in a bit with the songwriting as well, since there's definitely a decent portion of neoclassical influence on here, which shines through greatly in a lot of the melody. Furthermore, I feel like there's some Castlevania influence in a decent portion of the songwriting here, another thing that's both very fun to note and adds nicely to the album. Ultimately, the songwriting on here comes together beautifully and is another big checkmark for the band as far as I'm concerned. Considering the atmosphere and emotion that everything invokes, I'd say it more than excels at what it sets out to do. In regards to the aforementioned atmosphere and emotion, this album also excels in both. As I touched on earlier, most of the feelings on this record are more or less negative ones, with more of a depressing outlook on life displayed in each song, and the atmosphere the music creates matches that quite well. The keyboards play the primary role in maintaining the atmosphere on here, and do a great job at that, always having either a fairly haunting or sorrowful aura, one that tends to resonate quite well emotionally. I also feel like the album gets darker the more it goes on, save for the cover track, that is. But in regards to the original songs, the mood tends to drop as the album continues, which works very well in culmination with the climactic 18-minute finishing track on here, a song that I personally find to evoke the most atmosphere and emotion of them, considering how amazingly composed it is and how tragic the tale conveyed is. I did already mostly touch on it earlier, so I won't drone here, but needless to say, the album has some beautifully done atmosphere and makes me feel the big feels. And with that, we may as well get on with covering us some individual tracks, starting with the intro track on here, Facing the Truth. Now this song is definitely the most straightforward power metal track on the album, and as such does lean more into pure power metal as far as songwriting goes. As such, it's also easily the most upbeat track, with constantly catchy melody lines and generally a higher tempo than the other songs on here, specifically with the nice galloping pace on the riffs. We get some nice orchestral bits with the organs leading in on here, and the guitars tend to take a pretty big forefront alongside the vocals, both of which tend to be pretty inspirational and soaring on here. On top of that, the backing vocals on here are pretty great as well, filling out the sound wonderfully. And while we're on the topic of vocals, it would be a crime not to mention the guest vocals on here by Leo Figaro, which pair quite nicely with Lucas's own, the two bringing forth some fairly unique vocal tones and both hitting some ridiculous highs when they harmonize at the peak of the song here. Ultimately, this one is probably the straight-up catchiest track on the album, and whilst being one of the shorter songs, it packs a ton of great energy. Next we get Disengage, which is a much slower, methodical, and more sorrowful composition in comparison to the last. The song starts off with a more serene intro, making lots of use of piano before heading into the riffing, of which the percussion actually stands out a nice bit from an intensity perspective on here. The vocals and guitar already sound much more forlorn and sorrowful, the melodies definitely having a much more morose feel overall. The song is more of a middle ground as far as emotion goes, not being as intense as either the opener or the climax of the album, serving as a really good middle point with its more numb, desensitized feel, which works extremely well in the context of the song, obviously. That being said, the intensity that the riffs bring forth on this thing is certainly still quite impactful, and as usual, the choruses on here are highly memorable. This one definitely brings down the tone of the last song and changes the atmosphere to much more suit the rest of the album. On top of that, it has some great diversity, having a bunch of proggier sections thrown in to keep things consistently interesting and engaging, whilst still retaining complete coherency. The amount of piano on this thing definitely helps with the sorrowful vibes as well, which is a great time. Also, the solo on here, pretty damn spicy. The third song on the album is Jaded, and starts off with much more of an intensity than Disengage had, with some fairly speedy, more tremolo-like riffing to start, though generally maintains a mid-tempo overall, I would say. The dynamic between Lucas vocals on here and Jonas Heidgert is a bit more distinct than with Facing the Truth, in my opinion, and works really, really nicely on here. It also has some nice progression in the songwriting, very catchy choruses and all, and some great individual sections, especially with the guitar, since I feel that's one of the most standout parts of the song, particularly when considering the solos here, which are beautifully written and performed. That being said, I think this is probably the weakest original track, in my opinion, as it's not quite as memorable or distinct as the others, as far as I am concerned at least, though that very well could change with repeated listens, who knows. And thus we get to the title track, which is both the final original track of the album and the longest song here, clocking in at a bit under 18 minutes. Furthermore, it's my favorite track on here, which is somewhat to be expected if you know me and my taste for long, incredibly written closing tracks. It starts off with a beautiful, more calm atmospheric intro, leading into a very sorrowful acoustic and vocal passage, before things eventually kick up into the full scale of intensity, shifting into the absolutely beautiful chorus, which culminates beautifully with an amazing and chilling vocal melody, before kicking into some more progressive instrumentals, then leading back into the song. It runs through more verse-like sections, more progressive moments, which add great variety, some very compelling solos, more atmospheric acoustic sections, all culminating back to the chorus, which repeats once and leads the song to an amazing climax. As mentioned prior, and put extremely plainly, the song is about a man who loses his lover, gets drunk, thinks he sees her ghost, follows the specter to the grave, digs up said grave, opens the coffin, realizes that she is in fact dead and gone, then commits suicide and reunites with her in the afterlife. Tragic and fairly touching, and each passage of the song reflects each segment of the story quite perfectly, in my opinion, though you'd have to listen to yourself to see how everything perfectly aligns. Musically speaking, pretty much everything about the song is perfect. There's not a single moment on here where I'm any less than utterly enthralled, and the performances on here are probably the most intense on the album in my opinion, with the vocals, guitar, bass, keyboards, percussion, everything feeling so ridiculously impactful, and naturally with a ton of impressive moments which are more than enough to add a new spot of intrigue with every repeated listen. It's written basically perfectly. The riffing on here is amazing and quite well varied. The melodies on here are, in my opinion, the strongest and catchiest that there are on the album. The solos are probably the most memorable in my opinion, and the atmosphere presented on here is easily the most potent. Furthermore, it probably has the strongest emotional impact on the entire album in my opinion, as it practically feels like it cuts straight into my soul each time I listen to it. It's so great. That and the choruses on here literally never cease to make me shiver in amazement. Like, I swear I've listened to the song a ton of times, and it still happens every single time I hear the chorus on here. Quite possibly the most well-written song I have heard all year, in all honesty. And after that, we get to the cover on this album, something I've primarily not talked about much until now. In all honesty, it's quite a well-done cover song, and definitely makes the song into something more in line with the band's songwriting as opposed to just generic metal cover of pop song. So yeah, as said earlier, it's a cover of Last Christmas by Wham, and the sound is very in line with what we've heard up until now from the album, with a very nice atmosphere to it, tinged in a bit of sorrow and heartbreak, and a sound that matches too. It feels more like a straight power metal ballad than anything, honestly. Furthermore, this is definitely one of the better choices they could have picked as far as Christmas songs go, considering the message is definitely more generalized. I'd also like to point out that the band somehow manages to make the melodies on here infinitely more beautiful, in my opinion, particularly with the vocals on here being as unique and emotionally potent as they are. It genuinely makes the bass song even more catchy and emotional, which is a pretty great feat. Overall, it's probably even better than the original song, so far as I'm concerned, to which I can definitely applaud the band here. Regardless of being better than expected, though, it does still feel a little bit odd, especially coming off of such an amazing finishing track. Not as out of line with the album as expected, but it does feel a little bit out of place, all things considered. So, yeah, that's basically everything covered. As you can tell, I loved the album, and it had some absolutely standout parts, even if not everything was perfect. Certainly the best progressive power metal release that I have heard so far this year, though, with some very impressive musicianship all around, some amazing songwriting, beautiful and potent atmosphere which invokes some great emotion, high quality variety throughout, pretty much all of the elements you'd want thrown together to make an incredible piece of music. And it's also mixed and mastered pretty dang well, too. Production on here is quite nice, consistent, and fits very nicely overall. Even with the slightly out-of-place moments on here, mostly looking at the Last Christmas cover on that one, it still holds up extremely well. Overall, I'd have to rate the album a solid 9 out of 10, and I would highly recommend it if you're a fan of progressive power metal, or just progressive metal, or just progressive music in general, or catchy music in general, honestly. Definitely an absolute ton to look forwards to here if you're a fan of like early Dream Theater, Symphony X, or Japanese power metal, as you'll hear some pretty relevant elements in the music here. And yeah, that's essentially all I have to say. Go check out the record if you haven't already. It's very good and very, very catchy. May take a few listens to appreciate some of the more progressive tracks on here, but it's very, very worth it in the end. As always, I have been Empyrean Serpent, and thank you for listening.